In the pre-pandemic world, a couple times a year, the seminaries would host a weekend for men considering a call to the priesthood, and referring to the gospel we just heard, it was called a come and see weekend, as the Lord tells the first disciples to come and see after they ask where he was staying. And these weekends would always bring with them some excitement for both the men coming on the weekend and for those of us in the seminary. If nothing else, because the food was usually a little bit better those weekends. And it was exciting to see prospective candidates for the seminary to come in. In my last few years of formation, I came to appreciate these weekends a little bit more, because all of the talk about vocations, the sense of call, discernment, would prompt me to think about my own call from God, my own discernment, my own struggles in responding to the call of God in my life. And I came to see how responding to God's call isn't just a one-time thing, but really is work for our entire life. I'm always struck by the reaction of the disciples in our gospel today. The only question we hear Andrew ask the Lord is, "Where are you staying?" Jesus calls both Andrew and Simon Peter to follow him, something that would change their lives forever, even changing Simon's name, calling him Peter. And it astounds me that they had almost no follow-up questions, no hesitation about what they were getting into. They just went. And after I began thinking about the priesthood seriously near the end of high school and even into my first few years of seminary, I had a ton of follow-up questions. I really needed the Lord to answer my uncertainties. I really had no idea what the Lord was doing in my life. I couldn't understand why, of all people, he would call me. And my struggle became focusing more on why God was calling me rather than the fact that he was calling me. Unlike the disciples, I was hesitant. I was filled with questions. I learned later that I needed to remember that first encounter that I had with the Lord, that first moment I knew he was calling me. And just like in the gospel where they know exactly what time it was, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I can still remember very vividly that first moment that I sensed that I was called to the priesthood. It was at Mass one Sunday when I was in grade 12, as the priest was lifting up the chalice at the elevation. This incredibly intense desire to be a priest sprung up within me. My struggle was to learn to trust in that moment, to trust in the fact that God had done this amazing thing in my life, rather than wonder why he was doing it. For our disciples in our gospel today, it was that first encounter with the Lord that led them to leave everything behind and follow him and bring others to him as well. After staying with Jesus, Andrew comes to his brother Simon and exclaims, "We have found the Messiah," and brings Simon Peter to meet the Lord. It was that first encounter with the Lord that changed everything for both Andrew and Peter. It was that first encounter with Jesus that led them to continue following him despite the doubts they had, despite their fears, despite their quarrels about who among them would be the greatest, even despite their desertion and denial of the Lord on Holy Thursday. They didn't let their unbelief, their unworthiness, their mistakes stop them from following the Lord, because they were convinced by that first encounter that Jesus was indeed the Messiah, the Son of the living God. After the Lord's death and resurrection, Andrew and Peter would give their lives for the sake of the gospel because they were convinced that he was the Messiah. And it began with this first encounter that we hear about in our gospel today. The struggle that I had those first 2 years of the seminary was in seeking clarity about God's call rather than trusting in him. I wanted to know why God was calling me. I wanted to know how I was going to be able to be a priest despite my unworthiness, despite my weaknesses. And instead of remembering this great encounter with the Lord and all that he had done for me, and trusting in that, and asking for clarity, I was focusing more on questions that God had not yet answered, rather than all the things he had already done in my life. God calls each one of us to a particular vocation, whether that's to be a priest, to be a religious sister or brother, to be married, to be parents, to the single life, even to a particular job. And all of these things are wonderful. All of these things are great. And each one of these vocations is both a gift and a mystery. God calls us to our particular vocations in life because he has planted a desire for it in the very depths of our hearts. Why he does this, why God calls us to whatever we're called to in life, why he calls us to these great things is ultimately a mystery, one that we will never fully understand. Because of this, the temptation we have is to try and figure out everything all at once, to try and solve the mystery of God's call in our lives, especially when life brings about twists and turns and unexpected challenges. It is when we experience these challenges that we can want to seek clarity the most. But instead of trying to figure everything out at once, we must be like Samuel in our first reading today, who, despite not fully understanding what was going on, as he kept mistaking the Lord's voice for Eli's, was still able to respond to the call of the Lord by saying, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." It is in responding to the call of the Lord, despite not fully understanding everything about that call, that allows us to trust in him, to remember the amazing things he has done in our lives, to grow ever closer to him, and lead others to encounter the Lord as well. And no matter what God has called us to, this really is our vocation as Christians, to grow ever closer to him each day and lead others to him as well. We live in a very uncertain world right now. The pandemic has upended our sense of security, our sense that we were somewhat in control of things. We used to be able to say with reasonable certainty what the world would look like a year from now. We can't even really say what the world will look like on March 1st. One of the struggles or fears that I had in the seminary was not knowing what the church was going to look like in 50 years. I don't even know if we're going to be open on Ash Wednesday. While this uncertainty and the ever-changing nature of the pandemic is frustrating, as Christians, we know that we have been called to do something great by the Lord Jesus. And so we must trust in the encounters we have had with him to carry us through the challenging, disappointing, or uncertain moments of our lives. And we can trust in God with confidence because we know that he has called each one of us to a vocation, that he has called each one of us to something great, and that he has done so by planting a desire in the depths of our hearts for that. And because of this, our lives are a mystery. The temptation, when times get challenging or uncertain, is to try to figure this mystery out. Instead of trying to figure it out, we are called to live it out by remembering all that God has done for us so that we can continue to grow in holiness, to continue to draw ever nearer to the Lord, and to bring others to him as well. It is in trusting in our encounters with the Lord in confusing and uncertain times that we can make the words of our psalm today our own each day of our lives. Here I am, Lord.